Sports reports, no gimmicks, no clowns. 2-5, Mr. Logical, we run this town. Real talk only, no chasing, no doubt. From the east to the west, it's the order we shout. Mic check, lights flash, game time, stay ready. 2 vets in the zone, keep the pressure real heavy. Big hits, big plays, yeah, we breaking it down. Truth rings in your speakers, every word is the crown. From the north side hustle to that southern flame. Midwest grind, west coast of the game. Sports talk kings, yeah, we wear that crown. Turn it up, let them know it's about to go down. Sports reports, no gimmicks, no clowns. 2-5, Mr. Logical, we run this town. Real talk only, no chaser, no doubt. From the east to the west, it's the order we shout.
It's about to go down.
Yes, it's Tuesday night, y'all. Sports Reports is ordered in your ears. Those are the sounds you're hearing. I am your unorthodox statistician, going left so much you thought I was southpaw. I go by the name of 2-5. Tonight is a Big Ten preview. The last conference to win the last 3 national titles. How about that? We're going to get into previews, predictions, who's going to make the college football playoff, you know, a little bit of storyline starting out. But like, review, subscribe, share, rate, do all the free things, do all the good things. Liquid death in hand. Don't forget to listen to Say Less, Say More. And let's get right to it. And oh, by the way, we are everywhere that you get your podcast. So as I mentioned, the Big Ten, the last 3 seasons, won the national title. And, you know, there's a funny narrative going around, right? Because at one stage, the SEC was the dominant conference. You know, after the year 2000, you know, you had Auburn with an undefeated season. You had Bama winning national titles. You had Florida, LSU winning national titles. And then we had to acknowledge that the SEC was the best conference. Okay. So now in the Big Ten, you know, the last 3 years, Michigan, Ohio State, Indiana won the national title. But the SEC is still saying, no, we're the best conference out here. Does not compute. So the thing is, the SEC is 2-7 in the 12-team playoffs. And if you think about it, a lot of those games are against each other. You know, you had Alabama over OU last year, for example, in the first round. You had Ole Miss and Georgia both got a bye, played each other in the second round, and then Ole Miss lost to Miami, who went on to play Indiana for the national title. So the Big Ten might not play as tough an out-of-conference schedule as the SEC does, but does that really matter when you get to the playoffs? Because all those games are out of conference. You still get a little break, you know, in between if you get a bye, and we don't need to get into the teams with a bye, what their record has been since the 12-team playoffs started. But the point is that this is the new era of college football. NIL, you know, paying for your players and everything, legally that is. You know, so you get a team like Indiana who come out with Curt Cignetti. You know, he was at James Madison. He's just a winner. He comes to Indiana. They win 11 games year one. Only losses were to Ohio State and Notre Dame. Any other team in the nation, we clap our hands for them. For Indiana, we said, told you they wasn't that good. They come back last year, first team to go 16-0 in history. How about that? Curt Cignetti, maybe the best coach in the country, at least top 3 or 4. So that's Indiana. Now, the impressive thing about Indiana is if you go back historically, Indiana's at the bottom of the barrel. You know, they were lower than Kentucky, lower than Vanderbilt, and dare I say, and I'm not coming for my guy Residente, but lower than South Carolina. And here's Indiana hoisting a national title trophy. How did they do it? People say, well, they had old dudes. Okay, Wake Forest and Northwestern have old dudes every 3 years. They're not winning national titles. These days, they aren't even winning conferences. It's just a way to knock Indiana because their name is Indiana. All right. So Heather Dinich got on TV yesterday saying that the SEC wants to leave. Interesting enough, you know, Mr. Logical and I have been talking about the NFC, AFC style league for the SEC and the Big Ten. Now, right now, it sounds like the SEC is the only ones that are, feeling this way. Kirby Smart came out today and said he's always felt that way. It wasn't slander, man. I was just speaking of fact. That's all it is. You said you like the truth. I'm giving you the truth. But what does that leave the Big Ten? Because I don't think the Big Ten would sit by idly. The only problem is if the SEC and Big Ten were to try to blow this joint, so to speak, then litigation would pound them into the ground. It's always like, me living here in Texas and people saying, why isn't Texas independent? We want to go back to being our own country and all that kind of stuff like that. And it's like, well, yeah, until you got taken over. So, so from that standpoint, the SEC might be on an island by itself. But we know that the Big Ten and SEC have been arguing with Congress and with the other two Power Four conferences about this new Protect College Sports Act. More to come on that. So what's big in the Big Ten this year? Penn State, life without James Franklin. So let's recap that. James Franklin, 104-45 record at Penn State. Now, remember, he got there in some dire times. There was the whole scandal. Bill O'Brien took over, went to the NFL. James Franklin came in from Vanderbilt. Only through his time, 104-45, but they only won one Big Ten title. Now, while you might turn your nose down at that and say that makes James Franklin overrated, here's a little something for you. Penn State joined the Big Ten in 1990. They have 4 titles since that time. So that's 36 years for y'all doing math out there. 4 titles, James Franklin has 1. The reason I say don't hold your nose up at James Franklin is because he and only one of those other 4 titles are outright titles. They had to share the other 2. So James Franklin, in his time at Penn State, did things that Penn State only did once in the other 35 years of being in the Big Ten. Now, does that mean that James Franklin is a great coach and that Penn State is going to miss him? Yes and no. So, yes, he's a great coach. No, I don't think they're going to miss him in the way that you would think when you listen to his head coaching record. Now, it's always funny, and I'm not going to stay too long on this. Cover your ears, Rez. I'm not going to stay too long on this. But when we talk about somebody like, say, LeBron James, who has a losing record in the NBA Finals, we talk about he wasn't favored, the super teams that he had to compete with, the teams that got together to stop him, right? So you want me to bang on James Franklin for losing to Ohio State and Michigan? Everybody loses, at least to Ohio State. Maybe not Michigan so much, but Michigan's been good over the last 10 years or so. And that Big Ten title that James Franklin won, 2016. So we're 10 years sitting away from that. Enter Matt Campbell, a guy who took Iowa State to the Big 12 title game. And I know a lot of you are going to sit out there and say, Iowa State, Big 12, whoop-de-woo. Who cares about that? Iowa State hasn't even won a conference since 1912. He had them on the brink just 2 years ago. Every year, Iowa State was a contender to bite you in the butt, just like their neighbors in Iowa City. They're a team that you didn't want to play. I think he's going to bring that same attitude to Penn State. This year, Penn State, 40 transfers, 24 of them from Iowa State. So I don't say that to say that Penn State is going to win the Big Ten. They're going to be a Big Ten contender, but they're going to be a damn good team. And I think they will be in the future to come. James Franklin, made the playoff one time. He was one possession away from a national title game. Drew Aller with that late interception against Notre Dame. Notre Dame went on to ironically play Ohio State for that national title. Could you imagine Penn State and Ohio State playing for that national title and James Franklin with the reputation that he has, especially against Ohio State, Ryan Day looking for his first national title? Could you imagine the pressure, the talk, and the nerves going on in that game? To some degree, I feel like we were cheated. I'm sorry. We were. Can Michigan just get back to football? A couple of years ago, it was Jim Harbaugh with hamburgers or cheeseburgers. He got suspended a few games, had to coach from the hotel room. They say he wasn't coaching, but we know he was putting some plays and putting some input in those games. Then you had Sharon Moore take over, former offensive lineman at Oklahoma, came through lots of bad coaching decisions. I'll give him a break. He was a first-time head coach. The game against Oklahoma last year especially wasn't a good look for Sharon Moore. And then you fast forward, and he off the field did worse things than he did on the field, allegedly. I ain't going to recap the story. If you don't know the story by now, you don't want to know it. But now, Ward Manuel, the Michigan AD, is out at the end of the year. So it's been a tumultuous last couple of years for Michigan. They've been punished by the NCAA, fined. They've won a national title. Harbaugh left and went to the NFL. Sharon Moore went to jail. And here we are with Kyle Whittingham coming in from Utah, of Pac-12 championship fame, Utah, that is. So Michigan is going to be its normal, tough, hard-nosed, knock-you-in-the-dirt football team. We'll just have to see if Bryce Underwood can put it together. Wisconsin, where are they right now? Luke Fickell, right? We thought he was on his way out. And then they pulled off upsets at the end of last year. They beat Illinois. They beat Washington. Top 25 wins, for a guy that was supposed to be out the door. So he gets extended. Here we are again, starting the process all over again. But if you look at Wisconsin's schedule, which we will later, you will see that, hey, he might be sticking around at least another year if they can put it together. Will USC finally make the playoff? That is a question that I never thought I would have to ask about the Trojans, or Trojan Angeles, as I like to call them, because of their blue blood status, because of who they are. USC, especially when you go back a mere 20 years ago, it sounds like such a long time now, but you go back to the Pete Carroll days, they were always in the mix, always a national title threat. They were winning national titles. Lane Kiffin comes in, and then they've been kind of doing the plateau hills up and down thing all throughout the years, to include the Clay Helton era. But now they have Lincoln Riley, who still hasn't won a playoff game, who had all these quarterbacks, right, going back, Jalen Hurts, Kyler Murray, Baker Mayfield. And then, he comes over here to USC. Caleb Williams won the Heisman. He's got Jaden Maeva right now, who's probably going to be a top 10 to 15 NFL draft pick next year. So can USC get over the hump to make the playoff? If they are, this is the year to do it. Because as you look around, Ohio State is still loaded, right? But they lost so much. But a team like that, they reload. Indiana starting over at quarterback, starting over with a lot of defensive pieces. A lot of great players, but still starting over. At some point, it was different when you were talking about schools like Alabama and LSU reloading in Ohio State, because they're bringing back their already great 5-star players. Whereas with a team like Indiana, you're bringing in transfers. At some point, it has to go awry, or it has to not be as great as it was the previous year. Oregon, can they get over the hump? We've been waiting for Oregon for about 15 years now. Remember, they made that national title game against Cam Newton. They made the national title game the year that Ohio State beat everybody with their third-string quarterback. So Oregon has been on the brink. Now Dante Moore's back for another year. They picked up Corey Parrish from Minnesota, playmaker, special teams. Oregon's loaded, so the Big Ten all around has a lot going on for it. USC and Ohio State are two of the youngest teams in college football. The difference is Ohio State has Julian Sayin, who's a Heisman candidate. They have Jeremiah Smith, who's a Heisman candidate. They have Ryan Day, who got the monkey off his shoulder and got the national title. Now we're just waiting for Lincoln Riley to join the party. But there's no Mekhi Lemon. Jacoby Lane's gone. But USC has a new defensive coordinator who we'll get into just a little bit later. But all that to say, how about those Hoosiers? So the Big Ten, it doesn't just stop there. You got UCLA. Why is UCLA important? And, of course, your first answer might be because they have Nico Iamaleava. No, that's not the correct answer. The correct answer is because Bob Chesney is their new head coach. Coming in from where? James Madison. Sound familiar? Bringing some transfers with him? Okay. Now, I'm going to tell you what I did not say. I did not say UCLA is going to win the Big Ten. I did not say UCLA is going to make the college football playoff. But what I am telling you is UCLA is going to sneak up and get somebody. And they might just get two somebodies. And it might start week 1 over in Berkeley. So, yeah, that's what's going on around the Big Ten. There's lots to get to, so let's just jump right in. So I'm going to start this off. Oh, and before I do, let me recap real quick. And I apologize in advance to the Pitt Panther fans because somehow I forgot to talk about you all the other night when I did my ACC preview. I got you finishing 5th for those of you that care. But my ACC championship game was Miami over Louisville. Let's see what we end up with the Big Ten. So Oregon, this is a team that I just talked about, waiting for Oregon to get over the hump. Dan Lanning as Oregon's head coach, 48-8. He's the new Ryan Day as far as just looking at him and say, let's get it done, pal. What are you waiting for? But you go back 48-8, right? One of those losses is to Ohio State in the playoffs where they got their pants pulled down. You know what I mean? One is, or two are to Washington and Michael Penix. You know, so it's not like he's out here losing to Northwestern. He's out here losing to Oklahoma State or any of these teams like that. When Dan Lanning loses, he makes it count, and he loses to the best of the best. Now, when it comes to you know, at the end of the day, why hasn't Oregon got over the top? And it's easy to say Dan Lanning choked in big games. I don't believe that. You know, I just think that sometimes teams lose games. You know, everybody that loses isn't a choker. Sometimes the other team is just better. When they lost that game to Ohio State in the playoff, for example, 2 years ago, they had beat Ohio State in the regular season at Autzen. Ohio State was coming out for blood on that day, and Ohio State was the best team in the country. So when they lost that game, you could call it a choke because they were the only undefeated team, and Ohio State, they had beat Ohio State, so you could call it a choke. But if you were watching football, if you were keeping up, you knew that wasn't a choke. Ohio State was just a buzzsaw, and they paid it forward by winning the national title. So the thing about Oregon this season is they got a lot of turnover, but it's on the coaching staff. So Will Stein, the offensive coordinator who came here right from the Alamo, you know, he's gone. He's the head coach at Kentucky. So then, you know, defensive coordinator Tosh Lapoy went to his alma mater, so he's back at Cal, you know, to be the head coach there. So that's how you know you got a good thing going, is when you lose your coordinators in the same year, especially like you look at a team in the NFL like the Philadelphia Eagles, constantly coordinator changeover. That means people are trying to get your secrets. They're trying to get your sauce, and they're trying to get on your level. So, like I mentioned, his record, right? He is 1-5 against teams that ended in the national title game. Can't make it up. They won the Big Ten the first year in the conference. And, of course, that playoff came, so it was a little bit bitter. You know, they did lose the Autzen, in Autzen to Indiana last year, 30-20. Thought it was a fluke. Got back to the playoff. First play of the game, right? Dante Moore with the pick six. So Oregon gets into these big games. They get off the slow starts. But the good news is that Dan Lanning has the defense generally that keeps them in the game, that keeps them competitive in these games to where it doesn't get away from them. So last year they did win 2 playoff games, albeit I know one of them was against James Madison. But they shut out Texas Tech, you know, who was a sweetheart last year, the media sweetheart last year. Won the Big 12. A lot of people had them as a surprise team in the playoffs, you know, but it wasn't, but, you know, it just wasn't to be. Oregon's bringing back DeCorian Moore, one of the best wide receivers in the country. You know, he was a true freshman last year. He showed a elusive playmaking ability, hands that you would die for. They're getting Evan Stewart back from injury. So when you look at that already, Evan Stewart came into last year as someone who had a lot of NFL hype. People thought he was going to be one of the first receivers off the board last year. He got hurt. So you're adding that back into a talented roster. You can't complain about that. Oregon's on its way. They went and got Iverson Hooks from UAB. Ask my fantasy football team how much we love Iverson Hooks. So Oregon, bang, bang, bang. Who do you take away? I think DeCorian Moore is too much of a playmaker, gets separation pretty easily. Evan Stewart is a playmaker. And then you got Iverson Hooks. I don't know who you're going to stop. You got to try to force him to run the ball. But guess what? You can't do that either because they got Jordan Davison and De'Aaron Hill back. Combined, 7 yards per carry, 20 touchdowns, over 1,300 yards combined together. On defense, they bring back so much. They bring back Bear Alexander, Mateo Alphabet. Of course, that's Uyangale for those of you out there. And Brandon Finney. I brought up Coy Parrish coming in. The only thing better than having Coy Parrish is if they still had Dylan Fenneman. So I think that Parrish had a sophomore slump, so to speak, last year. And even with that, he had 82 tackles from the safety position, 3 tackles for losses. He had an interception, 3 pass breakups. And guess what? He averaged 26 yards per kickoff return. So everywhere you look across this roster, speed, more speed. So now the question about Oregon is going to be, with the new coordinators, how does that look? How much does the offense change? Dante Moore, is a great quarterback. He's probably going to be the number 1 pick in the draft. Probably would have been this year too, in my opinion, if he would have came out. And guess what? If all else fails, you got Dylan Mahomes on the bench. I mean, Dylan Raiola, that is, of course. They brought in Carl Williams from Baylor to help out the defense. This might be the best defense in the country for all intents and purposes. But can the coordinators get the best out of them? All right, so let's go over to Columbus. Last year was an odd year for Ohio State. Week 1, they brought the Longhorns in. Arch Manning, right? Won that game 14-7. It was a snail-type game where all you saw was conservative play. Ohio State knew that Texas couldn't move the ball on their defense, so they decided, hey, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to sit on this. We're not going to turn the ball over. We're not even going to score until we have to, Arch Manning had a chance late in that game on 4th down, to, force the action, maybe get it to overtime, but he just couldn't make the play. Ohio State's defense was just that good. Sorry, y'all, it's getting hot in here. But then, after that game, they won the rest of their regular season games by a score of, like a combined score of 39-8, basically. So you couldn't even score touchdowns against Ohio State. They lost to Indiana on a field goal in the Big Ten title game. And the thing about that was Ohio State showed that when they had to get punched in the mouth or they had to respond, it was a little tougher than they thought. So they were able to get out on teams early, put them in a sleeper hold, and just choke them out for half the game before they ran up the score on you. But when Indiana pushed them back, they didn't have an answer. Indiana came in there. They were the number 1 and 2 defenses in the country in that Big Ten title game. And Indiana forced Ohio State to try to make plays, and they couldn't. That's where being conservative all year bit Ohio State in the butt. Now, Mr. Logical likes to talk about how Julian Sand doesn't challenge the defense down the field. That was by design. I do think that Julian Sand can challenge defenses down the field. There just wasn't a need to. If I'm holding you to 8 points, why put the ball in danger? Now, you do have Jeremiah Smith, so you want to get him involved in the action. No Carnell Tate this year, but you do have Chris Henry Jr. coming in. So, that's going to be a plus, obviously. You got my guy, Devin McEwen, from right there, UTSA, coming in. So the Ohio State receiving corps is not going to miss a step. They got Bo Jackson back in the backfield. They got 2 transfers at tight end, Kyle Parker from LSU. Oh, I'm sorry. They brought Kyle Parker in. He's a wide receiver. They got tight end Hunter Velsing from Northwestern and Mason Williams from Ohio U. So Ohio State is still going to be able to dictate their score. They're going to be able to move the ball up and down the field against most of their opponents. Now, they do have Oregon coming in, at some point this year, as we look at the schedule here. So, looking at this, they get the Texas game in week 2 down here in Austin. And then it's pretty much on cruise control until week 7. So, they should beat Illinois. They should beat Iowa. They should beat Maryland. Then they get Indiana bye week, USC, Oregon. Whoa. Now, 2 of those games on the road. The IU and the USC game, both on the road. Oregon game at home. Now, we talked about Oregon a second ago. Don't forget, Oregon opens up with Boise State. We saw that 2 years ago, right? Ashton Genty, Oregon needed a punt return and a kick return for a touchdown to put that game away, and they still only won by 3. So Oregon has to go to USC. USC hasn't beat Oregon in eons, but the rest of Oregon's schedule looks pretty manageable outside of this trip to Ohio State. They get Washington at home. So who makes the Big Ten title game between these 2 teams? Now, Ohio State lost a lot on defense, as they do just about every year. Sonny Styles, Lorenzo Styles, so on and so forth. But they brought in Terry Moore from Duke and Earl Little from Florida State for the defensive backfield. And, if from that thing, Earl Little is one of those guys who's kind of a soul of a defense kind of player. So I like that pickup a lot. Ohio State overall, had 3 defenders picked in the first 11 picks of the NFL draft. And, of course, there was Reese as well. But the schedule is tougher this year, so that's going to be the problem. When you go back to the playoff game, Ohio State ran into some of that same issue with Indiana. Miami wasn't afraid of them. Miami had the speed to contain them. And Ohio State just tried. They got behind, and then they had to try to turn it on real quick after being conservative all year. They only ended up with 3 possessions in the second half because Miami just pushed them all around. Remember last year on Sports Reports' Order when I was asking, is Miami the best team in the country? Because they can win in the trenches, and that's how you win football games. People laughed at me, called me all kinds of names. Who played in the national title game? Who beat Ohio State? Just saying, but Ohio State's going to be good again this year. So looking at it, I can see Ohio State finishing anywhere from 9-3 to 11-1. That's going to be dependent on Bryce Underwood. That's going to be dependent on Oregon. And then, the Indiana game. So, I think that Ohio State has the ability to come out buzzsaw status like they did against Oregon in that playoff game 2 years ago. So, Indiana better be on the lookout for that. Speaking of Indiana, 27-2 the last 2 years. 11-2 the first year with Curt Cignetti. Lost to Notre Dame in the first round of the playoff, and last year they brought it home 16-0. They lost a lot of talent. Amari Cooper, Kalen Black, Elijah Surratt, D'Angelo Pons, Aiden Fisher. They lost a lot, but they brought it back, right? Who did they get? Josh Hoover out of TCU to replace Fernando Mendoza, who, by the way, went number 1 in the NFL draft. Hoover, 9,629 career yards, 71 touchdowns, but he got to clean up those 33 interceptions. Now, with that being said, if Indiana's going to have a downfall, I think that's what it's going to be, is the Josh Hoover turnovers. They went out and got Turbo Richard at BC, who I talked about during the ACC preview. He reminds a lot of people of Kalen Black. So, and I think he might be a little bit better. Then you got Rylan Nowakowski, tight end, left in the NFL draft. So Indiana's offense is going to be a makeshift in progress. The difference is that, as Curt Cignetti does, they bring in talent. They went and got Nick Marsh from Michigan State, another one of my favorite fantasy football players. He's my favorite wide receiver this year in college football, the same way that I looked at Denzel Boston and Antonio Williams last year. I just love watching him play. They still bring back Charlie Becker, So those two on, that go back to Oregon, right? I talked about the Corian Moore and Evan Stewart. So now you got Charlie Becker over here. You got Nick Marsh over there. Defense is going to be in trouble. All right. They got Shaz Preston from Tulane. The O-line is still going to be good, but the D-line could see a little regression, because they were just great last year. That doesn't mean they're going to fall off a cliff, but they were just that good last year that you imagine that they can't be as efficient this year. Even though they have Toby Usanami, who a lot of people are loving. Everybody's been raving about him in and outside of Bloomington. So I think that the defense has the potential by the end of the year to be as good as last year's defense. But, you got to look at that schedule, right? And as Indiana always does, somehow they get away. Indiana's the team that the SEC's talking about when they talk about your non-conference schedule. Look at this. North Texas, Western Kentucky, even though that's my school, I ain't going to say too much about them. Buffalo, then you get Northwestern and Rutgers. Indiana could be 6-0 heading into that Ohio State game, and that's at home. But then they get Michigan back-to-back. You know what I mean? Then at the end of the year, before Purdue, they get USC and at Washington back-to-back. So tougher schedule than they had last year. But this is the Indiana Hoosiers that we're talking about. I think they get clipped by Ohio State. That's first and foremost. I think they can handle Michigan. That USC game becomes real interesting, but we're talking about USC going from west to east. Remember, they lost to Illinois last year. Just 2 years ago, they went on the road and lost to Maryland, of all teams. So that Washington game at the end of the year with my guy, Damon Williams, Weapon X, that's going to be the game that decides if Indiana makes the playoffs or not. So I think you could literally end up in a situation where Oregon is 11-1 or 10-2, Ohio State's 11-1 or 10-2, and Indiana's 11-1 or 10-2. So if Oregon played Indiana, we would have ourselves a little round robin, but the only way we could get that matchup would be the Big Ten championship game. Now, USC, we talked about them. They're bringing in Gary Patterson as defensive coordinator. So all you fans out there, that know Gary Patterson from TCU, that his defenses are humming. Now, I question whether he's going to bring the 4-2-5 that he's known for in. If he is, that's going to be a different look for the Big Ten. Now, with the USC talent, California speed, that could be a dangerous defense because Deanton Lynn had them playing lights out at times last year and overall over the last couple of years during his tenure. So they're not upgrading per se. They're not downgrading. They're just keeping it smooth and changing philosophy. Jaden Mayeva, 5th leading passer in the nation last year, 3,700 yards, 3,711 to be exact, 24 touchdowns. But how does that look without Mekhi Lemon and Jacoby Lane? Now, he does have Tanuk Hines. If you don't know that name, get the tapes ready. Saying Jay-Z at Hot 97, he's only 16. Tanuk Hines is going to be that next great USC receiver. Last year he had a game against Oregon, 6 catches, 141 yards, and a touchdown. Wayman Jordan is back in the backfield from injury. They also bring King Miller back. That might be the best 1-2 punch at running back in the conference. If not, it's at least top 3. So defense is always going to be the question with a Lincoln Riley team. But Prophet Brown and Alex Graham are back at safety this coming year. Both missed time last year. So that took some of the sting out of that Trojan defense. So secondary overall is going to be the biggest hole I see on the team. Jontez Williams coming back from an ACL. I'm still mad at USC. Because why the hell is Notre Dame not on this schedule? I already had to deal with this with Michigan. And they're talking about the earliest they could play Notre Dame possibly would be 2030. So look at the schedule. They start off with San Jose State. Then they get Fresno State, Louisiana, Rutgers at home, on the road. So they should be 4-0 heading into that Oregon game. But then they get Washington back-to-back. They're losing one of those, if not both. The good news is they're both at home before they go to Happy Valley. So think about that for a second. You got Oregon, Washington, then you travel to the East Coast to Penn State to Happy Valley. Then you come off your bye, you get Wisconsin and Ohio State, cool, but then you get another bye. So basically, over the course of a 6-week period, you're getting Oregon, Washington, Penn State, Ohio State, and Indiana. And then, of course, you close the year, at Inglewood, with Bob Chesney, who I just talked about. So this is not an easy schedule for USC, even though you may look at some of the teams and say they should win that game. Well, USC should have done a lot of things over the last couple of years that they haven't done. So Lincoln Riley is on show and prove time with me. But as I look at this, like I said, they split the Oregon-Washington game, more likely to beat Washington, even though I'm not so sure. They should beat Penn State, but with USC traveling east, you just never know. So USC could be looking at 8-4 here if things just slip off the rails. I think a 9-3 USC could make the playoff. It just depends on who those 3 losses would be to. So if you're USC and you lose to, say, Oregon, Ohio State, Indiana, and it's going to be hard for me to keep a 9-3 USC out of the playoff. I mean, hell, Bama got in with a 21-point loss to Georgia in their last game before the playoff. So now I'm going to keep USC out for losing to these 3 teams? I think not, but we'll see when we get there. Washington, my guy, Weapon X, Damon Williams, and all the drama. Remember, he was leaving Washington. He got into the portal, said, do not contact me. And, of course, what did everybody do? Everybody said, that damn Lane Kiffin. So, allegedly, this all happened, and Damon wasn't necessarily involved in this. A lot of this was just schools trying to poach. He lost his agent over it. It sounds like his teammates are okay and on a good page with him, but where do those fans in Seattle stand with Damon Williams at this point? Is Damon Williams on get us to the Big Ten championship game time, right? And there's a lot to love about Washington. He threw for 3,056 yards last year, 25 touchdowns, ran for another 611 and 6 touchdowns on the season. The Huskies were seventh in red zone percentage last year in the nation. Problem is Denzel Boston's gone. Jonah Coleman's gone. They were 4th in scoring offense and 5th in total offense in the Big Ten. Now, they do have 4 starters back on the offensive line. So when you're a quarterback that's small like Damon Williams, you need all of that help on that offensive line that you can get, creating those lanes for you to get out into the open, to make plays. But we'll see if they can establish a running game. Last year in their 4 losses, Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And those were the 4 best defenses that they played against last year. They averaged 9.3 points in those games. Now, I remember, because I tooted my horn about Miami earlier. Now I got to keep it real because I did pick Washington to upset Ohio State last year. It wasn't to be. They had everything going their way until that fake field goal, and the momentum just came out the sails, and Washington just never really got started. So that's going to be the next question. Without your playmakers in Boston and Coleman, are you going to be able to generate offense against the better teams on your schedule? They do have to go to Autzen. And I don't know who made these Big Ten schedules. Maybe they were listening to the SEC. But, these back-to-backs are nuts because they play Indiana the week before that. Said, and then they, so I don't know. Washington's in a tough spot here. They do start with the Apple Cup. They do start with Utah State and Eastern Washington. So 3-0 before they play Minnesota. I'll get into Minnesota in a little bit. Go to USC. So then if you look at it, everything after the USC game should be manageable. Iowa, tough team, of course, but it's at home. At Purdue, no need to worry about that game. Nebraska's a question mark, even though it's in Lincoln. Penn State, question mark. Michigan State, probably going to be near the bottom of the conference. And then you get those 2 games. So realistically, Washington, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful to anybody, but their season comes down to those 3 games. If they could go 2-1 in those games, Washington might get to Indianapolis. They might get to the playoff. I don't think they will, but it's on the table. Ryan Walters had that defense humming last year, and Washington still has one of the best linebacking cores in the country. They lost to Dacario Davis and Price Lock at the corner. So not as good as last year, but a better schedule, because as I mentioned, they had Ohio State last year, not present. So we'll see. Penn State, we talked about Matt Campbell at the opening here. Guess what? He brought in Deanton Lynn from USC as the defensive coordinator, so I like that. 40 total transfers he brought in to Penn State, 24 of them from Iowa State. What does that mean? That means continuity. It's one thing to bring in transfers. Like last year, Purdue brought in 54 transfers with a new head coach. You know what I mean? So Penn State's bringing a lot of transfers with a new head coach. But these are guys that know his system. They've played for him. They know what it's about. And he's bringing in his quarterback, Rocco Beck. He's bringing in Carson Hansen, his running back. So Penn State is not going to be trying to figure things out. I think they're going to hit the ground running. And how could they not if you look at the schedule? Marshall to start out, Temple. Now, I will say, and don't laugh, I will say Penn State better beware of that Temple game. I don't know what the line is yet, but I'm already taking Temple to cover. Buffalo, Wisconsin, Northwestern. So Penn State should, and that's the operative word here, should, unless they get got by Temple, they're 5-0 heading into that USC game. You know what I mean? But then they get Michigan the week after at the Big House. They go on a bye. They get Washington after Purdue. So Penn State is another one of these teams that's going to be somewhere between 7-5 and 9-3, possible 10-2 with a break or two. Now, with that being said, anything less than 8 wins, disappointment. So not only did they bring in Rocco Beck and Carson Hansen, they brought in 4 of Rocco Beck's targets. But they do have 4 new starters on the offensive line, so that might get off. But like I said, look at the early schedule there. There's no need to panic. Let the defense carry it away because they will. James Peoples running back in from Ohio State as well. I think Penn State's going to be a good team. I think they're going to be a team that knocks off somebody that's going to be in this playoff race. Whether that's Washington, that's going to be tough because it's in Seattle. That whether it's Michigan at the Big House again, USC, travel, so like there's room here for Penn State to get to 10-2. I just don't see it for this year. But going forward, Matt Campbell, I feel, is one of the best head coaches in college football. A lot of people are going to disagree with me because he coached at Iowa State. So where's his wins? Where's his playoff wins? Where's his playoff appearance? Watch him work. Minnesota. I like Minnesota this year. One of my surprise teams. Now, that doesn't mean, like I said, that doesn't mean contender, but Drake Lindsey at quarterback. Redshirt junior coming in 63% completion percentage, sophomore. 3-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio. He did just get busted for DUI, so got to clean that up. But Darius Taylor is back. They throw Darius Taylor the ball so much, even though he's a running back, that he could finish this season top 10 in Minnesota receptions ever. You know what I mean? Don't kill me, Gopher fans, because I know Ski Uma, row the boat. But a lot of years, Minnesota is Iowa light. This year, I think that they're the Iowa that we're used to, but with a better quarterback. The question is going to be depth concerns on their lines, both lines, offense and defense. But they do return 71% of their offense, 65% of their defense. So they got that going for them. Corey Parrish, we talked about him going to Oregon. That's going to be a problem. How could it not be? But they still have Curry Brown roaming around. They still have Maverick Baranowski, who was 6th in the Big Ten in tackles last year. They have Big Ten sack leader Anthony Smith back. But they lost all their defensive tackles of note. You know what I'm saying? So Minnesota's going to be one of those teams as a PJ Fleck team, as you can expect from a PJ Fleck team. You're going to know that you played them. They're going to make you feel them, as the old cliche goes. So looking at the schedule here, that Mississippi State game in week 2, that's going to be the one that sets the tone for the season. Not because it's an SEC team, but because Mississippi State should be a lot better. You know, Jeff Lebby with another year at the helm. The offense is going to be humming. You know, so if you could get that game, you could be 3-0 headed to Seattle. Now, I don't think you get out of Seattle unscathed. You know what I'm saying? But you get the little brown jug. You know what I'm saying? And you know, like this year, can Minnesota beat Michigan? You know, I don't see why not, you know, with all the questions with Bryce Underwood, and get that little brown jug back. And yes, I do have questions about Bryce Underwood still. But, you know, so getting that little brown jug would go a long way to make Minnesota fans happy and to build a good season. You know, they're 25-78 with 3 ties against Michigan. You know, they're on a 5-game losing streak in the series. That series is a little more intense than you would think, because you think of Michigan, Ohio State. I think of Minnesota, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Florida, Rosedale, and Paul Bunyan's axe. But after the Michigan game, it gets manageable for a second. You know, you get Purdue, you should win that. So you could be looking at 4-2 right out the gate. You get Iowa at home. You go to Indiana, chalk that up. You know, UCLA is a toss-up. Can you get Penn State? You should get Northwestern. You should get Wisconsin. You know, it's at Camp Randall, but late in the year, snow, all the good things. Look, Minnesota is an 8-4 team, in my opinion. You know, outside of Washington, Indiana, and Michigan, there's not a team on this schedule that perks your attention and you go, we can't beat them. You know, maybe UCLA can get them just because of the Bob Chesney effect. Maybe Penn State gets them just because of that continuity I was talking about with Matt Campbell. But that's late in the year where Minnesota is going to be able to figure out their lines by the time they get to that game. So don't look crazy if you see Minnesota sitting there at, say, 7-3 with an outside mathematical chance to get to Indianapolis. Iowa, they got the second oldest coach in the nation, 71-year-old Kirk Ferentz. Only coach that's older, Bill Belichick. You know, he's been coaching at Iowa since I was in high school. Legitimately, I'll be 45 next month. Iowa, there's a couple of things you can always depend on with them. Tough in the trenches, great tight end play, lockdown corners, and a run game. Those are the things you can always count on with Iowa. Who's going to be their quarterback? Hank Brown is more of that Kirk Ferentz type quarterback, you know, but he's getting pushed throughout camp, you know, with Jeremy Heglinski. And, you know, last year they had Mark Gronowski who made plays. You know, he came over from South Dakota State. That's the kind of guy that's just a winner. And, you know, Iowa looked competent on offense. Hell, they even got up to 119th in offense. And though you may laugh, you know, there's been years where the service academies have had receivers catch more passes than Iowa receivers. So that's progress as far as I'm concerned. They're bringing back Kamari Moulton, 80 yards per game on the ground, 5.2 yards per carry. You know, now they are replacing 3 starters on the offensive line, to include Logan Jones, who won the Remington Award as the best center in the country. They're replacing 8 starters on defense, but in Phil Parker, I trust. You can usually pencil in Iowa for 7 wins, at the very least. You know, I think that they start off 3-0 before they go to the big house. Northern Illinois, Iowa State, and Northern Iowa. Now, Northern Iowa's been known to put a scare or two into the Cyclones and the Hawkeyes, right? So, market it in pencil. But they go to the big house, and then it goes to hell. You know, they go big house, Ohio State at home, at Washington. LLL Cool J. Then you get your bye week At Minnesota, Wisconsin, so 2 rivals back-to-back. Northwestern always gives Iowa problems. Even when Iowa's a great team and Northwestern is middle of the pack or worse, Northwestern still scares the bejesus out of Iowa. So, as I look at this schedule, it's manageable outside of those 3 games. The problem is that those 3 games are back-to-back-to-back. So that can start habits that you don't like. If fans have been calling for Kirk Ferentz to step down for years upon years, he just won't. He's stubborn. You know what I mean? So, but you gotta, they gotta go 3-0 to give them in the non-conference to give themselves any chance at all. Nebraska, my Cornhuskers, you know what I'm saying? And, I know y'all know me as a Florida State fan, but I am a Nebraska student. Matt Rule. So year 3 was last year. That's the year that you're supposed to get the Matt Rule stimulus, right? Dylan Raiola goes down. He held on to the ball when he was there too much and got all kinds of sacks. You know what I mean? Now he's backing up Dante Moore. So what do? You bring in Anthony Calandria, of Virginia and UNLV fame. Last year, 66%, 3,459 yards, 23 touchdowns, 9 picks. That is in 14 games. That was an improvement of the Anthony Calandria that played at Virginia. Now, he had Dan Mullen, over there. So how's it going to look with Dana Holgorsen? Emmett Johnson's gone to the NFL. So Makai Nelson and Isaiah Mazi played a lot last year. Well, I'm going to say a lot, but they got snaps. But I'm looking at Jamal Rule. No relation to Matt, different spelling. That's who I have my eye on. Wide receiver is going to be a bunch of guys trying to step up. Jacob Gill was the leader coming back. 24 catches for 278 yards. So everybody else has less than that or transfers that they're trying to incorporate into their offense. Now on defense, another new defensive coordinator. Of course, Tony White left for Florida State last year, so now you got Orange coming in from San Diego State. Guess what? Another 4.25. Nebraska was 3rd against the pass last year, 98th against the run. So, balance is the word. Now, Orange comes in from San Diego State with the 11th total defense last year, but of course, that was against a Mountain West schedule. So, but they did beat Cal last year, so take that for what it's worth. Nebraska has a veteran defensive line with Vincent Shavers Jr. Owen Chambliss is a great player, and I think the Black Shirts might be on their way back. So, looking at the schedule, right? They got a run here. Could they go 5-0? Now, the question is Michigan State, because with Pat Fitzgerald there, Michigan State's probably going to beat somebody that they shouldn't and be a little bit better than they're being thought of as being. Maryland could be a surprise team. We'll get to them here shortly. Could that be a team that ruffles up Nebraska early before you get that? Again, right? Indiana, Oregon, back-to-back, just like Washington. Said at least Washington gets them in the last 2 games of the year, but Nebraska gets them in week 6 and 7. They come out the bye and get Washington. They get Ohio State as well. So it's going to be a long year for the Huskers. If the Huskers can get to 7-5, I think that's a successful season, but it may be closer to 6-6. UCLA, I talked about them earlier. Bob Chesney brought Wayne Knight along for the ride. 1,200-yard games in 2 years at James Madison. He brought in Sahir West on the defensive line. He was a freshman last year. He had a 5 tackle for loss, 3 sack performance in the SEC title game. Don't be like that, Briz. That was the game that clinched the college football playoff for the Dukes. Wayne Knight, I mentioned 6.6 yards per carry. He got recruited by Ohio State during the portal season and went to UCLA instead. Look, the secondary, UCLA, Cole Martin, Roderick Pleasant, Scooter Jackson. You bring in Towel Johnson from Utah. Might be one of the best secondaries in the Big Ten. Neo Iamaieva, you're on the clock. It started off rough last year. Had a pretty decent year as the season went on. They brought in Samaj Morgan from Michigan. Hopefully that helps him out, but Samaj is inconsistent. But the good news about Samaj, if he holds on to the ball, danger. So Nico's going to have to be more consistent because when you look back at UCLA last year, they lost to New Mexico. That's not fun. That's not what Nico should be doing out here. They lost to UNLV. That's okay. That's better, but you still don't think that a guy like Nico, because remember, that first year at Tennessee, Nico led them to the playoff. Now, granted, their defense had a lot to do with that, but still. But right out the gate, UCLA gets a trip to Berkeley. That game is going to be one of the better games of the early season. It's in week 1 at Berkeley, old rivalry renewed, 2 quarterbacks, Ian Malieva and I'm not even going to try it, Cal's quarterback. San Diego State week 2 is interesting. Coach Sean Lewis, he's got a good thing going down in SoCal. Then UCLA gets Purdue and Maryland. So could you be 3-1 coming out of that? And if you are 3-1 coming out of that, what does that say about the rest of your season? You go to Autzen, chalk it up. Then you get Wisconsin, Michigan State, Nevada. So you could literally be in a world where UCLA is sitting here at, say, 6-2 after 8 games. So the bowl game within itself would be an accomplishment. But Bob Chesney ain't going to stop there. You go to Minnesota, you get Illinois, and then you get the Michigan USC closure. So UCLA, I think their range is a bowl game at the minimum, 6-6. A break here and there, that's a 9-3 team. If Wayne Knight hits the ground running, Sahir remains formed, because you always got to question these guys that come from the G6, right? Coming from that level of competition to come up against Big Ten offensive lines. That's always going to be a question until you see it in concept. I think they'll be fine. I think if I'm UCLA, I think I could beat Cal. If I'm UCLA, I'm 4-0 heading into Autzen in my mind. You know what I mean? And then, realistically, if I'm UCLA, I can look at this schedule and go, why can't I be 9-1? You know what I mean? Now, go ahead and laugh, but then think about what Indiana did. Curt Cignetti coming in from James Madison. Bob Chesney is a winner too. Go check it what he did at Holy Cross. So UCLA is not going to be a pushover, even though they wear that soft-ass color. All right. Wisconsin, the Badgers. I mentioned they finished last year 2 wins against Illinois and Washington. Luke Fickell got extended. So now they got a whole new offense. Colton Joseph in from Old Dominion at quarterback. I don't know the last time Wisconsin had a quarterback that, like Graham Merrill, maybe. Where was the last time Wisconsin had a quarterback? Graham Mertz. There you go. Well, who besides Graham Mertz, when did Wisconsin have a quarterback that a defense had to fear? They had Billy Edwards last year who, So Wisconsin's always going to be able to run the ball. They're going to emphasize toughness. They opened the season at Lambeau Field, and I know Mr. Logical hates that. Neutral site is his worst 2 words when it comes to college football. But they opened with Notre Dame. So you could chalk that up as a loss, I think, right? Then you get some cupcakes before you go to Happy Valley. So could you be 3-2 after that Michigan State game? Now, when you look at it, Wisconsin has the schedule to be successful. Last year they had Alabama, at Michigan, Ohio State, Washington, Illinois, at Oregon, at Indiana. I'm looking at this schedule this year. You got Notre Dame. We'll call Happy Valley tough based on the environment, but it's still early enough in the season that Penn State might have questions. You get USC at home. And then after that, who in those last 4 games puts fear in you? So Wisconsin could be an 8-4 team that's really a 5-7 team in principle because their schedule made them 8-4. I know that makes all the SEC fans mad. But it is what it is. They did grab Abu Sama from Iowa State, Abu Sama the third, that is. So I don't know. I'm gonna give Wisconsin 8-4 just based on the schedule alone. All right, the Illini won 19 games the last 2 years. Luke Altmaier out. Caden Hauser in from East Carolina. 66% passing, 3,330 yards, 19 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. Okay, Aiden Lowry and Khalil Valentine back in the backfield for Illinois. But together they got just short of 1,000 yards, 996 to be exact. Hank Beatty's gone, so transfer receivers. But the defense, now I know I've been talking a whole lot of 4-2-5, but this time Illinois is bringing in a 3-3-5 with Bobby Hawk, who you might remember as the former coach at Montana. Can they catch the conference off guard? Because I think a lot of teams and a lot of people, myself included, are going to be down on the Illini. But Brett Bielema is a great coach. Can they make it work? Looking at the schedule, you get an early start. You can start out 3-0 before you get to the Buck game. Then after that, who knows? Purdue. So could Illinois be sitting at 5-1 after the Michigan State game? Could they be 4-2 if they lose that Duke game? Then you get Oregon at Maryland, Nebraska, UCLA, Iowa. Like this is a manageable schedule too. So Illinois has the schedule. I don't think they have the personnel. So that same way I was talking about Wisconsin being an 8-4 team, with a 5-7 team with an 8-4 schedule, I think that Illinois is a 5-7 team with a 9-3 schedule. So I think it works both ways, but just not so good on the Illini side of things. Maryland. So I've been asking for Mike Locksley to be fired for at least 3 years, maybe 4, maybe 5. He's 37-49 at Maryland. Maryland as an entity is 39-58 in Big Ten games since joining the conference back in 2014. Malik Washington, he showed flashes last year. He looks like he has the potential to be a star. Malik, do me a favor. Stop throwing those 3-yard crossers, and those sideline passes that you can put a little bit of touch on. Stop Brett Favre it, because you don't got the receivers to be doing that. There's no Antonio Freeman, Desmond Howard, Donald Driver, Greg Jennings coming through that door. So Maryland was one of the nation's leaders in drops last year. And I think that was a big reason why, And then on top of that, they couldn't run the ball. Their leading rusher is back, DeJuan Williams. But what does that mean? He only averaged 3.9s per carry. We're talking about college football. 3.9 in the NFL is pretty decent. That's a first down if you get that every play. But in college football, you're sunk. You're stuck in the mud. As a team, they were last in the Big Ten, 104 yards rushing per game. On the defensive side of the ball, Sidney Stewart is back. Zahir Mathis is back. Maryland is going to be able to get after the quarterback. They're going to make life hell. They got Dante Joyner in the back with Jamari Glasgow. Those are 2 NFL corners following the steps of Deontay Banks. Now Maryland has to find a receiver, which I think they might. They might. From Old Dominion comes Naeem Abdul-Rahim Glading, who could be that next, right? You had Darius Hayward-Bay, Raheem Jarrett, Stephon Diggs. He could be the next of that lineage, but it's going to be if the offensive line can protect him. Now, when it comes to Maryland, there's always something that I have to mention because it hurts my soul being a resident Marylander, or I should say I was born in Maryland, lived in Maryland. 44-3-1, that's the record of Penn State against Maryland. What sucks about that is that Penn State's only on a 4-game winning streak against Maryland. That's like being in a basketball game and going on an 8-0 run and you're still down 16. What I'm saying? So, look, Maryland, the schedule lines up for them to be able to – they get Virginia Tech early. James Franklin, I think Virginia Tech wins. But for all intents and purposes, you get them early enough to where we can question it. You get UCLA a little early. You know, that was a good game that came down to the wire last year. I don't think they can win at Nebraska. They're definitely not winning in Columbus. But then you get Rutgers. So if I'm Maryland, could I be looking at 4-2 to start out? Maybe not. But, you know, the rumor or the thing about Maryland is that we always see is that they usually start 4-1. You know, they start 5-0, and then they finish 5-7 or something along those lines. Then they get Illinois, Purdue, Wisconsin. All toss-ups at this stage. Maryland, I'm telling you, I'm not saying this out of bias and because of hometown love. Maryland's loaded. They got talent. You just got to get it together. They brought in Clint Trickett as their offensive coordinator, moved Pep Hamilton over to an advisory role. Mike Locksley might be a little bit involved in the play calling, but I don't think if you're Clint Trickett, you come to a school like Maryland if you're not going to have dominion over the play calling. But, you know, so Maryland, I'm looking at 7-5 if everything goes right, 6-6 at worst. But this is Mike Locksley we're talking about. So we might be looking at 4-8 for real. Rutgers, the New Jersey Knights, if you will. Greg Schiano. Now, I know that he went to the NFL for a quick stint with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. You know, I know he was around. He was on Ohio State staff. But he hasn't beaten a top 25 team since 2009. You know, they lost Ethan Callie McManus. You know, he plays for my Commanders now, 7th-round draft pick. That was the first Rutgers quarterback to get drafted since Mike Teal in 2009, who also got drafted in the 7th round. But if you look around this Rutgers offense, weaponry. You know, Dylan Lonergan, you know, he was recruited by Nick Saban at Bama, 4-star quarterback. He's battling it out with A.J. Sarras right now, whose dad is coaching at Princeton. They have a lot of offensive line experience coming back. You win trenches, you can win games. Kyle Huff, he's going to be one of those chic names that you hear throughout the year, 6'6", 225. He could get off the line. He's going to make DBs look bad. You got Ben Black with his blazing speed, but you got to get him to hold on to the ball. Antoine Raymond, you know, running back, going to get a lot of touches. He's going to carry a heavy load. Problem is that there's another side of the ball. If they were just playing 7-on-7, Rutgers had a chance to finish top 6 in the Big Ten. But then you got to play defense. So out of all Power 4 teams last year, they were dead last in total defense. Dead last. You know, they did bring in Ty Morris from Rice, who I like a lot. Saw him in person against UTSA last year. 9.5 tackles for loss on the season, 88 tackles. Kaj Sanders, I need to step up. You know, he has all the talent, versatility, instincts, the proverbial Swiss Army knife at safety, but he just couldn't put it together. Very inconsistent last year. They had the heartbreaker against Penn State, 40-36 last time they beat Penn State, because, of course, I had to bring it up since I didn't want Maryland to be the only ones to get shit on. So they haven't beat Penn State since 1988. So how does it all shake out for the Scarlet Knights this year? You know, they got to go 3-0 out of conference if they have any ambitions to make a bowl game. They got to go 3-0. UMass, BC, who I think is going to be either last or next to last in the ACC. Lost to USC, but remember, USC coming east. You know, and then they get Howard. They get Howard, the Mecca. But they should win that game before they get Indiana. Come out of the bye week at Maryland, at Northwestern. Those are both toss-ups. Like, can you get the 5-2 going into that Michigan game? I'm just saying, it's on the 4-2. It's on the table. You know, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Penn State, Michigan. Now look, looking at this schedule, if I'm Rutgers, I'm thinking 8-4, 7-5. But it's all going to come down to that defense. So, unfortunately, I see 5-7. Northwestern, in October, Ryan Field opens back up. You know, $862 million in renovations. You know, that it's going to be ready to rock and roll. Now, this is the part of the show that is just hilarious to me because desperate times call for desperate measures. They brought in Preston Stone last year from SMU. It didn't go so well. Who could have predicted that, right? A guy coming off injury that got benched for Kevin Jennings, right? Okay. You know who Northwestern's new offensive coordinator is? He is 62-year-old Chip Kelly, who, of course, got fired by the Raiders, removed from winning the national title at Ohio State 2 years ago. Who's their quarterback coach? Gets even better. Jerry Neuheisel. Remember him? You know who got to be the interim offensive coordinator for UCLA last year after, they moved on and had UCLA beat Penn State. That was the game that pretty much got James Franklin fired. So, Northwestern is going to be interesting if nothing else. To top it all off, they went and brought one of the most volatile quarterbacks in college football in to be their starter. Aiden Childs, who I loved a couple of years ago at Oregon State, has all the talent in the world, just can't hold on to the ball. He keeps giving it to the other team, making bad plays. The IQ never developed, but I had high hopes for him at Michigan State because he was coming with Jonathan Smith, who I thought was a good coach. I still do. He just didn't fit at Michigan State. But we'll see what happens there. On the defensive side of the ball, another one of these secondaries, right? Robert Fitzgerald, Josh Fussell, and Braden Turner. You bring in David Walker. This is a secondary that can hold teams in check if, because there's the question mark, the defensive line, the tackles, can they get through on anybody? The line itself. But I don't even think it matters. It doesn't matter how good Aiden Childs is when you really think about it, because if you're looking at what I'm looking at, you see at Indiana, with Penn State back-to-back. You got at USC, at Oregon back-to-back. You close at Nebraska and Michigan at home. So I think that just looking at that schedule, and then I didn't even mention that team with the green O. So, if you're looking at Northwestern already, you're already 5 losses, I believe, before you even think about anything else. You're losing to Indiana, Oregon, Ohio State. I'm going to say Minnesota and Penn State. And that still doesn't include Iowa yet, Michigan, Illinois. I was looking at the Ohio State column, my bad. Illinois. So, I don't know, man. This is a tough schedule for a bad team. So I'm going 3-9. I think Chip Kelly will give us some fireworks, him and Jerry Neuheisel together, but it ain't going to go so well. Closing it all out, last 2 teams here. You got the Boilermakers, formerly known as the Spoilermakers, now known as spoiled milk. Because if you look at this, right, here, this is the skinny on the Boilermakers. 18-game Big Ten losing streak. Their only wins in the last 2 seasons are Ball State, Southern Illinois, and Indiana State. And for those of you keeping track, yes, that was 2 FCS teams and a MAC team. So that means that in the last 2 years, they are 3-21. Last year, they got shut out by Northwestern. They lost by 53 to Indiana, 56-3. They gave up another 56 to Notre Dame. Somehow, though, Bryce Underwood, Purdue only lost by 5 at the Big House. In those last 2 years as well, you also heard me say that, no Power 4 wins to go along with that 18-game Big Ten losing streak. So Barry Odom in year 2, who I think is a really good head coach. He came over from UNLV. He has to be questioning himself. All money ain't good money. I know that you get to coach in the Big Ten, but I don't know. This ain't the job because you brought in 54 transfers last year. You brought in some more transfers this year, which got good turnover at receiver with the transfer portal. You get Ryan Brown for another year, so hopefully he could put it together. He's put on a little bit of weight. They had the 17th total defense in the league. There's 18 teams. The last 3 years, Purdue has given up a total of 30 points per game in each of those seasons, at least 30 points per game. They're a work in process. In other words, there's always next year. So looking at the schedule, they get the week 1 win. Wake Forest could be a toss-up, but then they go out to Inglewood. Notre Dame come in. Ugh. At Illinois. Look at. I ain't even got to read the rest of this. Look, if Purdue wins 4 games this year, that is an accomplishment. So they could win the opener. They could start 2-0. They could. I doubt it because I think Jake Dickert, has something going at Wake Forest. So, I think, the other options for wins, they usually play Illinois pretty well. Maybe Maryland, Michigan State. Maybe you catch Iowa slipping. Do you play Iowa? You play Iowa late in the year, though, so they might figure it out by then. This is a bad team. Michigan State. So you got Pat Fitzgerald. You remember him? Northwestern head coach, fired for the hazing incidents, allegedly. Got a job. Now, this is one of those moments, right? I'm not going to be that guy. But I'm going to just say, I don't think if Pat Fitzgerald looked like me, he'd be a head coach right now. And I'm going to just leave it at that. Michigan State hasn't made a bowl in 4 years. Now, granted, bowl games aren't the sacred things that they used to be, and there's so many of them, you should still feel bad for not making one. Lots of depth concerns all over this roster. They did bring in Cam Edwards from UConn, 1,240 yards last year. Their quarterback, Alessio Milivojevic, I think is how you say it. Chip on his shoulder, pretty good quarterback with Pat Fitzgerald's coaching. Michigan State could be a lot better, but I wonder if they could get out of week 1 unscathed against the Rockets. The good news is that Jason Candle is in Hartford and not in Toledo. Okay, so Michigan State gave up 37 sacks last year. No depth on defense, even though I do like Jordan Hall, Mike linebacker. He's the leader of the defense. I like Nakai Martinez at safety, and they got his buddy Charles Brantley over from Miami. So Michigan State has pieces sprinkled throughout their roster, right? They're just sprinkled out, but this isn't – I don't know how good they're going to be. It's too – I can sit up here, blow smoke up your ass and say, hey, I see this is an 8-win team that'll surprise people. I could say, hey, they're going to win 3 games. To be honest, I have no idea. But looking at the schedule, you know what I mean? I'm interested in week 3, not because I think they could beat Notre Dame, but Michigan State-Notre Dame was one of those games of my childhood rivalry that should be played more often than it has been. But 2-0, I'll give them Toledo and Eastern Michigan. Nebraska's a toss-up. Wisconsin's a toss-up. Illinois, Northwestern. So if you're Sparty, if you could start 3-3, you feel real good. 4-2 would be even better, right? You go to UCLA, chalk that up as a loss, I think. At Michigan, loss. Washington, Oregon, loss. So, it just doesn't go well. But I could see 5-7. I'll do that. I'll split the baby and go 5-7. So, capping it all up, who does 2-5 think makes Indianapolis in the Big Ten championship game? Now, last year, I went out on a limb. And I didn't pick Ohio State to get to the Big Ten title game. Last year, I chose Indiana and Penn State. I thought Penn State was going to get over the hump last year. Obviously, Drew Allen got hurt. Some other things happened. Whatever. You know what I'm going to do this year? I'm going to still not pick Ohio State to get to the Big Ten title game. Give me Indiana and Oregon in the Big Ten title game. Give me Oregon as your Big Ten champion, but give me those 3 teams as the playoff teams. Oregon, Ohio State, Indiana. Those are my 3 playoff teams. Now, somebody between USC and Michigan has an opportunity to get a 4th playoff spot. Everything breaks to the right a little bit. Washington can be in that mix. Like I said, I don't like to close out with Indiana and Oregon at Autzen. For Washington, I think that pretty much ends their chapter. But, Michigan here, if you look at that Michigan here, if they could get that Oklahoma win in week 2, they played Oklahoma well last year. Sharon Moore just called a shitty conservative game that had no and look, I get it, right? It was Bryce Underwood's first start. He's a 5-star quarterback that you paid $12 million for. Don't put him on the field if that's the game plan. Now, I'm not saying that you got to come out here and try to be Patrick Mahomes, try to be Josh Allen, but that game was winnable. Now they have a coach and they have an offensive coordinator with Jason Beck that is coming in. You got Marshall back at running back, 6 yards per carry, 920 yards. The freshman, Savion Hyder. Oh, I can't wait to see this guy play football. I can't wait to see Donovan McCulley at receiver. Michigan has talent. It's just going to be the question of, can Bryce Underwood make it happen? Defensively, they brought in Jay Hill as defensive coordinator from BYU. He's going to mix up zone and man and keep quarterbacks confused, especially the younger ones, creative blitzes. Michigan's always going to play good defense for the foreseeable future. They also have a guy, and I'm about to be a little hyperbolic right here. And, if you were watching Sports Reports Disordered, you know how I feel about Will Johnson. I think Jair Hill has potential to be better. Michigan's also got John Henry Daly coming off of ACL from Utah with Kyle Whittingham. 48 tackles, 11 and a half sacks, 2 forced fumbles. He'll be a redshirt junior this year. Going back to my original point about Sharon Moore, Michigan had 52 red zone opportunities last year and scored 32 touchdowns. So that's going to be the question. You got Bryce Underwood, get him in the end zone. The threat of Bryce Underwood should be enough for play action to work. And I think Kyle Whittingham will bring that. He's a great coach that brings toughness. He kind of reminds me of what Iowa fans would like Kirk Ferentz to be. So Michigan is going to be in the mix. But when I look at it, I can't say for sure that they beat Oklahoma. I think that Minnesota game could get hairy up in U.S. Bank Stadium. Indiana's a tough game, but it is at home. You go to Autzen, I'm chalking that as a loss, and you go to Ohio State, I'm chalking that as a loss. So I got Michigan sitting at 8-4. But if all goes wrong, it could go 7-5, but I'm going to go 8-4. But give me Oregon over Indiana again in the Big Ten title game. And then, of course, we'll get into national title picks and playoff picks at a later date. But I will be back on Friday. Hopefully Mr. Logical will be back. But Friday is Big 12 time, one of the best conferences every year as far as the conference race goes, besides last year, Texas Tech kind of ran away with it. But most years, there's 5 to 6 teams that can win the Big 12 legitimately. And don't think I didn't notice Colorado on that Northwestern schedule either, and they played Georgia Tech to start the year. So we're going to talk about Coach Prime. We're going to talk about Kansas State, Avery Johnson, another year of me trying to believe in him. But, in the meantime, don't forget on Thursday to check out Say Less, Say More live, YouTube and all the places, live on TikTok even. But like, review, subscribe, share, rate, do all the free things, do all the good things. Liquid Death in Hand. I love you. Thank you for your support. Thanks for everything. You guys have been great, especially over the last month and a half, 2 months or so. Let's keep the momentum going. Sports Reports Disordered. Biggest movement since Dipset. Sports Reports Disordered. Out.
Hey! Sports reports, no gimmicks, no clowns. 2-5, Mr. Logical, we run this town. Real talk only, no chasing, no doubt. From the east to the west, it's the order we shout. Mic check, lights flash, game time, stay ready. 2 vets in the zone, keep the pressure real heavy. Big hits, big plays, yeah, we breaking it down. Truth rings in your speakers, every word is the crown. From the north side hustle to that southern flame. Midwest grind, west coast of the game. Sports talk kings, yeah, we wear that crown. Turn it up, let them know it's about to go down. Sports reports, no gimmicks, no clowns.